everyone, my name is Kate. I am an archaeologist and historian, and today I will be reviewing the game The Devil in Me from the Dark Pictures anthology. If you're not familiar, this is a horror series in which you play as various characters and attempt to have them all make it through the experience. You control their choices and actions throughout the game, and every choice has real in-game consequences. Also, a very large disclaimer, there will be spoilers, and this game is filled with blood, guts, and gore. If that is not your thing, then check out one of my other videos, and I will see you in the next one. In this video, all the game footage I will be using comes from GameTrack. Be sure to check out their video, which is linked in the description below. In the game, we follow a documentary film crew making a production about the notorious serial killer H.H. Holmes. The team receives a mysterious invite to a remote hotel filled with H.H. Holmes artifacts. Upon arriving, the team quickly realizes that things are more dangerous and deadly than they first appeared. They must survive a killer and his murder castle. First, some background on the time period and the Chicago World's Fair in which Holmes was active. Chicago was working to recover after the massive 1871 fire that burned a little over 3 miles of the city, which left 100,000 people homeless and did $200 million in damages, which would equate to around $5 billion today. When it came time to choose a city for the 1890s World Fair, Chicago won the chance, and they saw it as an opportunity to become stronger. The World's Fair was a large-scale event that showcased achievements of countries all over the world in art, technology, and science. The buildings designed by Daniel Burnham was called the White City because the collection of neoclassical buildings shined a brilliant white. These buildings were not meant to be permanent, but the later Chicago would grow to include some of the theme. The Palace of Fine Arts, constructed for the fair, later housed the Field Museum, before the field was moved to a different building in the 1920s. Afterwards, the Museum of Science and Industry was moved into the palace, and it continues to reside there today. Additionally, the Art Institute of Chicago was constructed for the fair, and it still stands in the same place today. Also, fun fact, the giant Ferris wheel, called Chicago Wheels, was invented by George Washington Gale Ferris Jr. for the fair. Other wheels existed, but never to this size. It was 264 feet tall with 36 gondolas. Each could seat 60 people for a total capacity of 2,160 people, allowing a view of the city like no one had ever had before. The fair drew visitors from all over the world. They were entertainment as well as the news. It introduced people to different products, the latest technology, as well as an opportunity for nations to show off. It is in this melting pot of people that the killer H.H. Holmes was active. H.H. Holmes, born Herman Webster Mudgett, is often described as America's first serial killer. However, that on its face is wrong. Lavinia Fisher and her husband were active in the early 1800s. Now, you can debate whether or not the husband or both are considered serial killers, but either way, they were active 80 years before Holmes. Additionally, Belle Gunness was active in Indiana 6 years prior to Holmes. So, the claim that he's America's first serial killer fails. If we consider John Fisher a highway robber, as that was his conviction, and not a serial killer, then Holmes would be America's first male serial killer. This also largely depends on your definition of what a serial killer is. So I define it as having 3 or more victims, and this definition Holmes meets. Others would define it as a killer who kills multiple, driven by the thrill of pleasure they get from killing, and in this case, I do not believe Holmes would meet the definition, and I will explain why in a bit. A quick background on Herman Mudgett. He was born in New Hampshire in 1861 and was described as a quiet kid, smart, and had an affinity for money. People often felt uneasy about him because he wouldn't look them in the eye. However, he did have strabismus, which caused him to be cross-eyed. His condition made it difficult for him to look anyone in the eye his entire life. In 1878, he married Clara Loving, and the two had a son together. While they were married, he attended school and became a physician and a teacher in 1884. The marriage was described by neighbors as possibly an abusive one, and Clara left him, returning back to New Hampshire in 1884. In 1885, Mudgett moved to Pennsylvania and then to Chicago in 1886. It is upon his arrival that he coined his famous alias, H. Holmes. Now, this name is not related to Sherlock Holmes, as the first story of the series would not be published until 1887. Holmes attempted to divorce Clara on the grounds of infidelity, but it was thrown out due to lack of evidence. Around the time of the case, he also, quote-unquote, married Marta Belknap. Since his divorce wasn't granted, he was legally married to Clara, then married Marta in some sort of small ceremony. It is here that the so-called murder castle is introduced. The castle plans began to be drawn up in 1887, which included businesses downstairs and apartments above. The third-floor hotel space wasn't added to the building plans until about 5 years later. Included in the original building plans were hidden compartments and staircases, but these areas were by no means secret, as everyone who worked there in the building knew about them. There was a hidden back room that the clerks would hang out in. There were hidden staircases leading to a secret bathroom on the second floor, so these rooms were not created with murderous intentions. By 1888, Holmes, his second quote-unquote wife, Marta, and Marta's mother, Lucy, moved into the apartments above the stores. Holmes became known at first as a con man. He has several lawsuits against him for not paying architects and contractors who built his castle. In his pharmacy, which he somehow passed the state licensure test for in 1886, despite never going to school for pharmacology. He sold all sorts of medicines, including his own version of snake oil, which we will talk about later. He peddled a mixture made of silver, claiming that it was a cure to alcoholism. He had his style of scheme in which he would sweet-talk investors to get massive amounts of money, and then never fulfill his end of the bargain. For example, in 1890, he began a glass-bending business, taking money from investors. He kept buying furnaces like he was actually working on it, but then never produced any product. In 1891, he bought the ABC Copier Company, which sold machines that copied writings and drawings. He used this business as a front to get more money and buy things on credit. All the while, he continued to be involved at the castle, and everyone knew he was not an honest businessman. In 1893, his collectors came knocking, specifically for the furniture he had bought to start filling up his space. They came into the hotel and they found nothing. The rooms were empty. In March 1893, a company bribed a laborer $50 to show them where the furniture was hidden, and then that person showed them the secret rooms stuffed to the brim with furniture. After they were found, they let the other companies know, and everyone just descended on the house, taking everything from all the rooms that they could find. This more or less put a stop to his plans of building a hotel. As you can see, Herman Mudgett, aka H. Holmes, was as far from honest as you can get. In a quick overview of his victims, there are about 9 murders attributed to him. For the purposes of this video, I will be giving only basic information. If you'd like me to dig deeper into the details of all his victims, his trial, and the journalism after, let me know in the comments below. His first victims were Julia and Pearl Connor. Julia's husband left her in 1890, and Julia was working as a cashier in the Holmes Englewood building, aka the castle. Julia and her daughter Pearl went missing around Christmas 1891. Holmes later claimed her death was an accident. She died while he was performing an abortion. If this is true, and Julia was an accident, then Pearl most certainly was not. Based on the trends of his later behavior, he likely poisoned the child because a dead kid was easier to deal with than a live one. In 1892, Emmeline Segrand came to Chicago looking for work and was hired by one H. Holmes. They seemed to be on friendly terms until the end of the year she began to express some concerns about him. She was last seen December 6th. Holmes, when asked where she went, said she ran off to get married, even showing people announcement cards when pressed about it. She was never found. Minnie Williams arrived in Chicago in 1863 and was hired as a secretary for Dr. Harry Gordon, one of H. Holmes' aliases. Minnie married Holmes in the spring of 1863, becoming his third wife while he was still married to the other 2. Minnie wrote her sister Nanny, inviting her to join her and Holmes to see the World's Fair and then join them on a trip to Europe. Nanny was last seen July 4th, and Minnie was last seen July 5th. On July 7th, Holmes wrote the apartment building he had been housing the sisters at that he no longer needed the apartments. They were never found. While he was with Minnie, he met Georgiana Yoke in 1893, and the two began to date. Georgiana married Holmes in 1894, while he was still married to the others, and went with him when he left Chicago. She would stay with him as his wife until he was caught by police later that year. Before his arrest, he hopped around the states doing fraud and crime until he began to initiate the fraud that would ultimately get him caught. He brought his friend from Chicago, Benjamin Pinsell, in on a life insurance scam in Philadelphia. The two would fake Pinsell's death by replacing his body with a cadaver and then collect the insurance money. Only Holmes would double-cross and kill Pinsell, likely using chloroform to suffocate him and staging it as an accident. After Pinsell's death, he collected the insurance money and then began shuffling Benjamin's widow, his own wife, and the 3 Pinsell children around the country. While traveling, none of them knew about each other. So while Holmes is trying to run from the cops, he's also trying to keep everyone involved separate from each other. Eventually, he decided enough was enough and decided to kill the 3 kids. Eventually, the deaths of the Pinsells caught up with him, and he was arrested. Holmes was an extremely melodramatic man who loved attention any way he could get it. In his confessions, as well as his autobiography written in 1895, he claimed to have murdered people in horribly sadistic ways. He confessed to the murder of 27 people. However, the police believed it was around 100 based on the number of missing persons reports from the time period he was in the area. It is from these confessions that the media took and ran away with it, and thus was born the legend of the serial killer H.H. Holmes. Throughout the game, there are hints at his supposed killing methods, and I'll be going through some of them in this video. Before talking about Holmes specifically, I'm first going to talk about this poster for snake oil. You may have heard the term before to describe a product that is fraudulent or a scam. The original snake oil actually hit the market at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. It was invented by Clark Stanley, who claimed he learned the secrets of snake oil from a Hopi medicine man in Arizona while working as a cowboy. He claimed his snake oil could cure animals, humans, rheumatism, toothache, sciatica, animal bites, and pain relief. To advertise his product, he slaughtered rattlesnakes at the grounds of the World's Fair, boiling them in front of people so they could see the product production. He gave himself the nickname of the Rattlesnake King, and he was pretty successful. After the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, his snake oil was tested in 1916. It contained mineral oil, fatty compounds of beef, capsaicin, which is from chili peppers, which causes that burning sensation, and turpentine. As a result, Stanley was fined $20, and the snake oil made its way into popular vernacular to describe fraudulent products, such as ones related to medicine. This relates to Holmes because he, as we talked about, peddled a cure for alcoholism that used silver. In reality, it didn't do anything. This was just another one of his scams. Both he and his product were not what they seemed. Here we get to see the murder castle in all its glory as it was operational in Chicago. Cable cars were introduced to Chicago in the late 1880s, although it is difficult to tell based on photos if a cable track ran past the actual castle. Other than that, the designer stayed true to the original appearance, complete with electrical poles. To my knowledge, there are no existing photos of the inside of the Holmes Castle, but everything looks like what you would expect of a vintage hotel. However, as already discussed, the castle never functioned as a hotel, as the 3rd floor was never completed. On the 1st floor, there would have been businesses, including a pharmacy and a jewelry counter, so there would have been people milling about. The reconstructed castle on the island is built with the spirit of the original, complete with the turret design. Of course, there are obvious differences. The island version appears to be much bigger, and it uses siding instead of a brick exterior. The island version has a grand entrance in the front, while the original was a corner building, and the main entrance was on the corner of West 63rd and South Wallace. Holmes' character model is based on the famous portrait of him, and the physical appearance is pretty spot on. However, Holmes, for all his charisma, was a rather nervous character. People who knew him as a young man described him as, quote, a man of medium height, slight build, and a very nervous temperament. He had a habit of winding his fingers together while talking. He He has a little black mustache and a pair of cold blue eyes, one of which, like his record, is not straight. One of his nicknames given to him by the press was the Beast of Chicago, which clearly inspired the Beast of Arkansas in the game. When it comes to his killing methods, he largely didn't resort to bloody methods. He preferred to use poison or suffocation as they were quiet and they left less of a mess. The idea that he gassed people came from a report that he suffocated 2 girls by locking them in a chest and then filling that chest with gas to kill them. There is no evidence he actually did this, and more likely he didn't, as there was no way to access the gas line at the location where the 2 girls were killed. Regardless, the media at the time sensationalized the deaths, often making up their own stories, and it certainly didn't help that Holmes himself confessed to killing many people in all sorts of different ways. In my opinion, he craved the attention he got by saying these things rather than actually confessing the truth. In the courtroom scene, the quote the game is named after, "The devil in me," is a real quote Holmes said in his confessions. He said, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact I was a murderer no more than a poet can help the inspiration to song, nor the ambition of an intellectual man to be great. The inclination to murder came to me as naturally as the inspiration to do right comes to the majority of persons." He did make the request to be buried 10 feet with cement on top, but it was not to instill the fear that he would come back. Rather, he didn't want his body dug up and dissected, a privilege he did not grant to his victims. It was reported that his execution took around 15 to 20 minutes for him to finally die. There are conflicting reports about whether or not his neck snapped during the drop. There were actually some people who claimed Holmes escaped death, and in 2018 his grave was excavated. The team found a false coffin 8 feet down, and then a real coffin below cement further down. The skeleton was certainly Holmes, as not only his dental records matched, but he also wore a waistcoat, boots, a bowler hat, and had a metal cross on his chest labeled H.H. Holmes. Unfortunately, as soon as the coffin was opened, the mustache began to fall off due to air exposure, and that was only aided by the fact that part of the trench wall collapsed on the skull. As a result, I could not find an image of the mustache on the skull. However, safe to say, Holmes did indeed die that day in 1896. The theme of mannequins and constructing humanoid figures out of corpse parts is inspired by the idea that Holmes used corpses to perpetrate insurance fraud. He reportedly came up with the idea during his time in medical school. He would take out large life insurance policies and then substitute the real person with a corpse and then turn around and collect. This was the scheme that he was going to do with Benjamin Purcell before he decided to murder Benjamin. It was rumored that he had pulled the scheme multiple times in his life, but there's no solid evidence he did anything but talk about that before Benjamin. As for his kills, it is confirmed that he dismembered at least one of his victims for easier disposal, but he never kept the parts to do anything else with. In the game, the moving hallways and secret rooms is inspired by the numerous stories created by Holmes and the press that the castle was filled with murder rooms. This famous blueprint was created by a journalist who had never been inside the building and was speculating based on rumors. As mentioned earlier, the original castle did have secret rooms and compartments, but these were for hiding merchandise, not for killing anyone. The fire room was inspired by the rumors that Holmes burned bodies at a glass factory he frequented. Current ghost tours dubbed the factory the body dump. In reality, Holmes did not dispose of his victims there. He owned the glass factory, and it was a method in which he could swindle investors. He would buy furnaces to give the impression he was running a profitable business, drawing in investors. In actuality, he was doing nothing but stealing people's money. All in all, Holmes is a subject of fascination based on the fantastical stories told by himself and the press. In reality, he was a greedy psychopath who killed at least 9 people in his quest for wealth. I think the game, through the conduit of the in-game killer Hector Monday, does a good job of capturing what a psychotic serial killer is like. However, I don't think it applies to Holmes. He didn't kill with an irresistible urge. He killed for, in his mind, logical reasons because they knew too much or they stood in the way between him and money. This game is more of a tribute to the horror genre like Saw and The Shining versus following the methods of H.H. Holmes. While I really enjoy the premise of the game, I found the ending rather disappointing. That unfortunately seems to be a recurring theme in this series. I suspect it's due to the fast turnaround time in which these games are being produced. I really enjoyed researching for this video. I'm a true crime junkie, and I always find digging into the lives of people that were involved in these things fascinating. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe so that you know every time that I post, and I will see you in the next one.